Okay. Can everyone see my screen? Good. Okay, thanks. So yes, as Rainy mentioned, am uh, I am at the NASA Global Modeling and Assimilation Office at Goddard Space Flight Center, and my main primary expertise is in carbon cycle modeling, mostly in doing atmospheric inverse modeling to understand carbon sources and sinks. And I've been involved, most of my activities so far have been involved a lot with the Orbiting Carbon Observatory team. And then more recently, I've started working on the Arctic Boreal Vulnerability Experiment. Um, I'm like one of the newly funded projects as part of Above. But then slowly, all of the different Above projects, they are starting to gather steam as we are getting more and more data, and the Above Airborne campaign is underway, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Then we are starting to see sort of these different activities coalescing together and coming together to give us a lot of fascinating information about the Arctic Boreal region. So without further ado, let me just go ahead and start my talk. So I'll just move directly to the second slide, slide 2. So as I mentioned, I mean, this is primarily going to be a very overview talk of all the different activities that are going on under Above, and then I've further narrowed it down to the carbon cycle component part. There are several co-authors and contributors, and especially I would like to acknowledge the Above leadership, so Scott Getz, Chip Miller, Peter Griffith, and Josh Fisher, who's actually the Above modeling working group chair, but who could not be here today due to a schedule conflict. And then also Eric Kaseshke and Hank Margulis from NASA headquarters, who primarily oversee the entire program management aspect. And then the slides that I will show today, they are built from sort of getting information from a bunch of different teams and a bunch of different groups, and I've tried to represent or acknowledge most of them here. But in case I have missed someone, then I apologize in advance. So the overall outline of my talk will be, I'll give a very brief overview of what the Above Airborne campaign or the Above entire field campaign is about. And a lot of you on the call, last week, for example, there were a couple of uh, different calls on sort of looking at remote sensing products or sort of the data products that will be collected as part of Above. And so a lot of you may have attended those, so you already have a pretty good idea about what the campaign is. So I'll try to go through that piece pretty quickly. Then I'll give a brief overview of the working group that have been formed under Above, and specifically the modeling working group and what its goals and activities are. And then I'll get more into the science side, sort of focus on what the current state of carbon knowledge is, what the outstanding questions and gaps are, and then some of the ongoing modeling activities. I have like a highlight slide from a few different groups and how they'll help us answer some of these questions that we need to know about the Arctic Boreal region, with the carbon cycle in the Arctic Boreal region. And then finally, I'll wrap up these project highlights with this fascinating project being led by Josh Fisher and Eric Stofferan, who's on the call, about the model benchmarking tool that they are putting together for looking at the modeling activities under Above. And then finally, I'll have just one or two slides on sort of challenges, and which I also see as opportunities for collaboration and coordination among different groups, and then just synthesize all of it together. So just quickly, what is Above? It is primarily a NASA-led study, and the overarching goal is to understand how vulnerable or resilient are ecosystems and society to environmental change in the Arctic and Boreal region. Most of you will be familiar with the Above domain. For example, the current study domain is sort of shown in red, and then the purple shows the extended domain that will be covered. The airborne intensive campaigns will be happening in 2017 and 2019. And the entire project is sort of put together under this vulnerability resistance framework. And where essentially it's primarily being driven by studies of ecosystem dynamics to provide the foundation for further research on the consequences to and what the responses of society to changes in ecosystem services. So it kind of takes a very holistic approach at not only just looking at ecosystem indicators, but then their impact further downstream on the ecosystem and then a society as a whole. So this is sort of what the scaling strategy, as it is called, for above looks like. So during above, there will be observations that will be collected from the leaf level all the way up to try to tie in remote sensing missions. And it's really like the airborne campaign, as I mentioned, which actually helps in bridging the gap between this plot and ground local scale studies to the remote sensing. And then the idea would be to like integrate or start scaling all of these different sets of observations into a single modeling grid framework, so that then we can kind of actually go across different observation, and even though they're taken at different spatial and temporal scales. Actually, a quick question, Emily or anyone, when I move my mouse, are you able to see that?
Yes.
Okay, great, thanks. So now, as I said, the 2017 campaign is underway, and 10 different aircraft teams, or at least 8 of them, have already participated, and 2 are on their way. We have already gone through we have already taken 2 or 3 rounds of measurements of CO2 and carbon dioxide, methane, and CO concentrations. And then during mid-May, mid-June, we have the UFSAR and Air Moss aircraft teams that took measurements to characterize soil moisture and active layer thickness. The peak growing season, and primarily this went on from mid-June to, in fact, last week, where we had almost 5 different aircraft teams that were in the region domain taking measurements to characterize vegetation structure, composition, lakes, inundation area, and everything. And now Ascends, which is on the DC-8, that is, even as we speak today, it is right on its way from California up to Fairbanks, and trying to get measurements. It will be taking LiDAR profiles of atmospheric CO2. And then what remains is, again, in late fall, we'll have UFSAR and Air Moss aircraft teams come back into the region and try to get a estimate of like what the maximum active layer thickness is. So yeah, a lot of wonderful measurements that are being taken, and those are slowly, we are trying to get a look at some of the quick look products and see how things are looking. So it's really going to be a very data rich environment for all of us come fall. So now in general, the overall organizational structure for above, for those of you who may not be aware of this, is that it is broken into different working groups. And there are like several, pretty much each working group was originally set up as per ecosystem indicators. So for example, hydrology and permafrost, vegetation dynamics, etc. And so under that same charter, we essentially have what we call as a modeling framework and comparisons group. And a description of all the groups and sort of what their overarching goals and activities are, that's actually available in the above concise experiment plan. This is sort of like a moving document, to be perfectly honest, and sort of it is getting refined and updated pretty often. But if you visit, if any of you want more information, you can actually visit any of the links noted here and to get more information about the different groups. So what is actually interesting about the modeling working group is that it kind of sits in between all the different observations that are being collected. So any of the field-based research or remote sensing, and sort of what all the ultimate stakeholders or sort of the ultimate societal responses, it kind of sits in between and tries to actually bridge the gap between the two. So it's really critical to sort of putting together the entire above activities and sort of achieving its goals. But then what also quickly becomes apparent is that the modeling working group just cannot work as its own. It's actually really spread out across all different teams. And that is why we kind of like to call it as a team of teams, because it really sits across all these different groups that are there and then tries to get information from all of them and synthesize it together. The overarching goal of the group is to integrate above data sets into global modeling community, sort of disseminate that information to the wider community, and hopefully facilitate improvement in simulation of ABR dynamics for the different ecosystem indicators. But then if we narrow it down more to sort of what the carbon cycle modeling group is specifically interested in, then we sort of go back to this. I mean, this is like a really broad question and sort of painted with a very broad brush. But again, as I'll talk a few slides later, this is very true, that how are the magnitude, fate, and land atmosphere exchange of carbon pools responding to environmental change? What are the biogeochemical mechanisms driving this change, and how will they, what its future trajectory will look like? So what is really our current knowledge of what the carbon budget in this domain looks like? This is the USGS report that came out last year, which was edited by Dave McCure and others. And in the very final chapter, they actually have put together sort of a synthesis information of what a 60-year record of carbon budget looks like. And this is also kind of follows, many of you would have seen, there was a paper from Dave McGuire, which kind of synthesizes the same information, but sort of in a little bit different format. But sort of the two numbers, what I would like to point out is that with the numbers that are that have been formulated here, it's actually really difficult to close the budget. And sort of the two big uncertainties that come to light is, for example, if you look at heterotrophic respiration and how much teragram carbon per year it has taken up, it's a really large number, most likely an overestimate, as the report actually acknowledges that. And then the fact that there is really no direct link between the flux of carbon from terrestrial side to the inland aquatic ecosystems. So this link is also missing. And because of this, it's really difficult to close the budget. And really, we at this point even, we do not know whether the Alaskan ecosystems have sequestered carbon in this historical period or whether they have lost carbon. And again, just to make the fine point here that this primarily dealt with the carbon balance for Alaska. So it does not really cover the above domain. There we have like larger uncertainties. And so this sort of automatically brings us to the questions of, so what are the big outstanding questions that we still don't know? I will go through sort of a list of bullet points here, and most of them are sourced from both literature and also different above project profiles, which are, I mean, and those project profiles you can actually go to this link and visit here. What I've also shown on the side here, and I'll keep on alluding to, is that, for example, of the different questions that I'll go through, you can think of them in different space and time scales. So on the space side, you can either think of as something at a plot scale, or like, let's say a 1 kilometer grid, or the entire above domain, or the full Panarctic region. And then similarly on time, you can have something at a diurnal versus seasonal versus annual, etc. And pretty much all the questions that I'll go through, or sort of the points that I'll go through, you will see that there is a big uncertainty range where we have a lot of, like what I like to say, known unknowns, in fact. There might be unknown unknowns, I don't know at this point, but for all purposes, we know there are this big known unknowns. So for example, what the overall carbon budget is, as I mentioned in the last slide. What is the seasonality in the carbon fluxes? This has been an interesting topic, and some of the CARV campaign data, so any analysis that seem to indicate that the cold season fluxes might be actually higher than what has been previously been hypothesized. So that is something which we have recently known, but also there is more work to be done on that. What is the interannual variability in carbon fluxes? That is equally another outstanding question. And the long-term trend in carbon fluxes, both for CO2 and CH4, again, based on the CARV campaign data, it seems to indicate that there is no long-term trend in CH4 fluxes, especially in the North Slope, but that needs to be evaluated throughout the entire Alaskan region, as well as like the entire Panarctic region. And then, so just also one point to mention related to the methane is, if you actually look at the methane emissions that was put together in this chart, which is around 0.9 teragram carbon, or roughly around like 1.2 teragram methane per year, that is actually substantially lower than what aircraft campaigns have been indicating for the past few years. So that again remains a big cause of disagreement. And then finally, the 2 or 3 other points to note is, for example, we do not have a good handle on reconciling the carbon budget between bottom-up and top-down approaches. there has been some actually work done for methane in this as part of the Surge methane workshop that was organized a few months back. And I know there are reports in preparation, and I believe there was actually Dave McGirt talked about it at one of the IRPIC meetings last week. We also need more knowledge and understanding of what the individual process dynamics and how they relate to carbon fluxes. And then, of course, the big question is what is going to be the trajectory of the future natural and anthropogenic carbon emissions. So a lot of stuff within this list, we know them at certain scales, but then for a lot of the other scales and a lot of other both spatial and time scales, we actually do not have a clear answer. And so now I'm going to quickly go through 3 or 4 sort of very high level overview of 3 or 4 different projects that are being done as part of above, and how they plan to address some of these outstanding questions that I have outlined here. So the first one, this is courtesy of Chip Miller, and he'll be working with the same team that he worked during the CARF campaign with Rogine Comain at Harvard University, Colm Sweeney at NOAA. And they are actually doing measurements of atmospheric CO2 and CH4 as part of the above campaign. And sort of their modeling projects will follow in the same vein that they did for CARF campaign, where they have a very simple strategy of running this sort of a localized model and trying to infer fluxes from that. The beauty of that approach is that it's a very simple setup, and it also makes it's quite flexible. So there are different variants possible, and you kind of get the full spectrum of uncertainty in what the carbon budget is. So this is primarily focused at looking at local to regional scale modeling. This is another exciting project that is being led by Brendan Rogers from Woods Hole Research Center. And here the focus is more in actually trying to look at fire dynamics and carbon emissions and sort of what are the relations between them. They recently had this paper come out in Nature Climate Change. And as part of the above project, what they're doing is developing this maps of fire forcing across the entire domain. They already have maps that are being hosted at the DAC, ORNL, and they're planning to extend that to the entire above domain for a longer time period. So this is another sort of cool project which goes from like local to regional scale modeling applications, but then gets at the fire dynamics and carbon interaction question. This is a highlight slide from John Kimball at University of Montana. And as part of their above work, they plan to deliver carbon fluxes at 1 kilometer over the entire domain. This is sort of continuation of the sort of the work that he does as part of the soil moisture active passive mission, the SMAP level 4 product, in which they use a very simple flux model based on vegetation and combining soil moisture estimates from SMAP to come up with estimates of GPP, respiration, net ecosystem CO2 exchange, and wetland methane. And so this is another sort of project which will be doing regional scale modeling, but then also getting at the question of what the interactions between hydrology and the carbon cycle are. And then this is sort of the project that I am leading at NASA Goddard, and where our interest is actually not just looking at the above domain, but instead now scaling it up and trying to look at the entire Pan-Arctic carbon budget. The primary interest is in looking at permafrost dynamics, but then we have like a state-of-the-art model that we are using to drive the land fluxes. But then we are doing it inside the entire this GEOS5 framework, which is coupled land, ocean, atmosphere system that is running at 12.5 kilometers globally. And so this is just like one simulation showing atmospheric CO2 concentrations at the near the surface for June of this year, actually. And sort of the next step is now to actually take this sort of the CO2 concentrations we have simulated from the model and then compare it against actual observations to see how well we are doing and how much we need to, again, then adjust our base land model to kind of get reasonable concentrations. So this again gets from regional to global scale modeling, but then also gets at getting overall handle on what the current carbon budget is and how it might project into the future. And then finally, this is the modeling benchmarking project that is being led by Josh Fisher and Eric Stofferin at JPL. And this is essentially an ILM type setup framework for, but just looking over the above domain. And just as a sample here, this table shows the benchmarking data that they'll be using for evaluating the carbon component, or sort of the output we'll get from the different models that I just talked about in the previous few slides. So this is again sort of a really cool project, which will give us some understanding of which models are performing well and which are not necessarily doing so well in this region. And this kind of just shows, takes you through the entire process. For example, if you start at the left corner, they have a website that's being set up where you can go in and upload your model. You can then choose which parameter you want to take, or you want to like look at. The benchmarking system then calculates all the scores, and then you can see this results on the custom web page, and then you can go back, tinker with your model, or sort of try to make it better, and sort of then repeat that entire process. So now sort of moving on to like, these were just a few samples from, I should say like only maybe like a fifth of all the different activities that are going on. And I just try to focus on those modeling activities, which are primarily looking at carbon, but there are again, several other modeling activities that are looking at simulating the active layer thickness, or simulating permafrost thaw, and others. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to touch on them in this discussion. But then just thinking in terms of carbon cycle modeling, and now we come to the question of, like, we have all these different activities that are going on, but what do we need more? Or where do we think the big challenges are going to be? And this is a really cool word doodle from Josh Fisher, where he surveyed different modeling groups and asked the different modelers, like, what kind of measurements do you want to see? What kind of measurements you need? And the size of the word here represents the frequency of response. So it seems like soil carbon is like the outstanding response that almost every modeler gave, saying that we need measurements of soil carbon to be able to see how well our models actually simulate that, or however our models are parameterized to use that information. The other key requirement is that all of these different measurements need to be concurrent in space and time and year-round sampling and geographic coverage. Lots to ask, but that's where hopefully above, and then coordination with NG Arctic and the different Canadian partners and others would help. So definitely this kind of counts as both a challenge, but also an opportunity for collaboration. The second challenge in my mind is that we currently lack a robust strategy for scaling between fine scale and global scale models, and also between observations and observations models. So this is just a cartoon sort of showing that different observations, even for above, will be taken at different space and time scales. And then, as I said, they will be kind of put together into a notional above grid that is being set up. But then we can either use that grid within a very local or regional model. But then when we talk about actually putting that system into a global model, then we actually start realizing that the global model resolution is still very coarse. For example, the simulation that I showed that was run at global 12.5 kilometer, which is really high from a global sense. But for really understanding the processes over the Alaska or like this Canadian, this particular high latitude domain, that's not enough. We know that we need to go down. There's much more subscale heterogeneity, and we need to actually go down to finer scales. So how to really get information across at different scales, I think still remains a big challenge, and which I know that other groups are also thinking about, and something that we should all discuss and try to brainstorm what options are available. And then finally, I think another opportunity where something like IRPIC can definitely help, or this kind of webinars really help, is that we need more coordination to synthesize knowledge from terrestrial and marine activities. And so I've highlighted a couple of the few marine focused activities that have taken place over the Arctic Ocean, especially IceCape and then Arctic Colors, if it goes through. At this point, as I said, when we look at that Alaskan carbon budget, we really don't have much information from terrestrial to marine, or terrestrial to the inland aquatic systems. And then after that, we have the entire carbon component. And we, again, that's sort of, I don't think we are having much exchange of information there, because we have to remember again that the carbon cycle is pretty well interconnected, and it has, the carbon cycle in this Arctic boreal region has the potential to influence climate system through feedback involving responses in both terrestrial and marine. So it just seems that this is, again, a place where a reasonable investment to integrate the many existing parts into a whole can actually help, and maybe we'll discover that we know more than what we have realized so far. So just to summarize, above is a large NASA-led study of environmental change in Arctic and Boreal regions. We are just getting geared up. It's essentially like 1 year into its full 10-year mission, and this is the first year that we are having the airborne campaign going on. There are multiple modeling activities that are ongoing. This span a large domain of complexity and approach and range over multiple spatiotemporal scales. But certainly we are optimistic that the carbon cycle modeling should bridge gaps in our understanding of what the overall carbon budget is over this domain. It provides a big continuity from the CARV campaign. It should help us understand what the seasonal dynamics and interannual variability of high latitude carbon fluxes are, and then help us understand some of these linkages between carbon cycle and other processes, such as between the carbon and water cycles, or between carbon and vegetation dynamics, etc. And with that, I'll end, but I'll just do a shameless plug for one of the AGU sessions that we are organizing as part of Above. This is called The Resilience and Vulnerability of Arctic and Boreal Ecosystems to Climate Change. It's primarily put together by the Above group of people, but it's again open to anyone who's working in this region, and we certainly will actually be sharing some great information about the data that is being collected and some of the early modeling results. And with that, so any quick questions? Sorry, Renu and Emily, I went a little bit over, I guess.